During the impeachment hearings, we heard from several diplomats and former diplomats who expressed concern about this administration playing domestic politics with foreign policy. One witness, former National Security Council Director Fiona Hill, she even called out the folks she was testifying in front of, Republicans, for the disinformation she says they're spreading.
Based on questions and statements I've heard, some of you on this committee appear to believe that Russia and its security services did not conduct a campaign against our country, and that perhaps, somehow, for some reason, Ukraine did. This is a fictional narrative that has been perpetrated and propagated by the Russian security services themselves.
Now, before I get to our next guest, I wanted to play one more clip. An interesting exchange here. This between former Special Envoy to Ukraine Kurt Volker and Democratic Congressman Mike Quigley of Illinois.
I cautioned Mr. Yermak to say that pursuing prosecution of President Poroshenko risks deepening the divisions in the country, exactly the opposite of what President Zelensky has said he wants to do.
So it's fair to describe it as you discouraged him from such action.
Yeah, I discouraged him. I raised concerns about what the potential impact would be.
And what was Mr. Yermak's response?
Mr. Yermak said, well, what, you mean like asking us to investigate Clinton and Biden?
Ambassador Nickolas Burns joins us now. He, a former Undersecretary of State and U.S. Ambassador to NATO, currently a professor of international relations at Harvard's Kennedy School. He's also an advisor for the Biden campaign. And that last exchange we heard from Volker, I thought was really telling that no matter how this impeachment process ends up and the ramifications for the president, there are already consequences specifically to not only our place in the world, but the idea that we can export not just the ideas of democracy, but when we're asking other people like Ukraine to do good governments, they turn around and say, who are you kidding? You guys can't lecture us here on not trying to go after political rivals. Look what you're asking us to do. And obviously, it's not just in Eastern Europe they've gotten this message.
One of the casualties of President Trump's policy towards Ukraine is that he subordinated everything else to his own personal political fortunes. Therefore, he wanted the Ukrainian government to go after former Vice President Joe Biden. And we've been telling the Ukrainians for the past 28 years, since it became an independent country after the breakup of the former Soviet Union, don't be like that. Don't be an authoritarian country. Don't be corrupt. Don't go after your political rivals. So it was supreme irony that President Trump and Rudy Giuliani were asking the Ukrainians to do exactly that. Go after, in this case, the presidents of the United States' political rivals, Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton. It sent exactly the wrong message, and I think the Ukrainians were right to think this is a little bit hypocritical of the Trump administration.
You know, Professor, obviously you spent a lot of your professional life in foreign service and obviously your experience with folks at the State Department, but I think for a lot of Americans, they got their first view, and I think they'd be hard-pressed not to walk away really impressed and thankful about the people on the front lines as the front face to the world, especially when you put that in contrast to some of this seamliness of some of the folks that obviously were advancing personal agendas. Now I want to play one more clip, this from Maria Yovanovitch, talking about the consequences to the State Department with this whole episode.
The crisis has moved from the impact on individuals to an impact on the institution itself. The State Department is being hollowed out from within at a competitive and complex time on the world stage. This is not a time to undercut our diplomats. It is the responsibility of the department's leaders to stand up for the institution and the individuals who make that institution still today the most effective diplomatic force in the world. And Congress has a responsibility to reinvest in our diplomacy. That's an investment in our national security. It's an investment in our future.
You know, one of the things I walked away with, Nickolas, after hearing her testimony and others is how shameful of Mike Pompeo as the secretary, the guy who talked, you know, the ambassador to come back to work here out of retirement, Taylor, to leave these guys hanging, to leave Yovanovitch hanging when her name and her reputation earned over decades of service to this country, to get her smeared by the likes of Rudy Giuliani and to stay silent out of it. I got to imagine for people who've served under administrations from both political parties that they all took note of what's going on right now. And for people who aren't doing this for the almighty buck, they'll think twice before they'll commit a lifetime when they know their country will sell them out if it's politically expedient.
Well, there's a crisis in the Foreign Service. The Foreign Service has been abandoned by the Trump administration in many, many ways. We've seen an exodus of senior and mid-level and junior officers. The State Department needs to be entirely rebuilt, the confidence of the people in it, as well as support for them. And it took on its most pernicious aspect when Secretary Pompeo failed to protect Ambassador Masha Yovanovitch, failed to keep her in the job, and then when she was summarily fired by President Trump, Secretary Pompeo didn't even meet with her. He let his deputy break the news to her. That's not leadership. And he has not stood up for the people of the State Department. And they feel it, and I think all of us on the outside feel it. I was a member of the Career Foreign Service for a very long time. These are friends of mine. Many of the people, nearly all of them, who testified over the last couple of weeks. And I do agree that if there's a silver lining in this very dark cloud of the Ukraine scandal, it's that the American people can see that in the United States Foreign Service, we have smart, honest, professional people who are nonpartisan, who are accustomed to working for both political parties. And that's a great, great glory of the United States, that we have a nonpartisan, not politicized Foreign Service. But they've been mistreated. And Masha Yovanovitch, I think, is the image of that, because she was unfairly pushed out. She was an outstanding ambassador to Ukraine.
Let's talk, if you will, about a couple individuals and what they've taken away from the hearings to this point. And let's start off with Vladimir Putin. I got to imagine he's doing cartwheels right now. And specifically, I got to wonder in Moscow what kind of resistance they think they'd get if they did even further incursions into Ukraine right now, if there'd be any pushback in the United States, even though they're an ally of ours. I gotta think that right now Putin's probably the happiest guy on the global stage given what's playing out in Washington.
We've been trying to contain Russian power in Eastern Europe for several decades. The message that President Trump sent was that he was only concerned about one thing, and that is getting Vice President Joe Biden, getting the Ukrainians to investigate him. He didn't seem to care about helping the Ukrainians to fend off the Russians, and I think Putin has emerged, unfortunately, tragically, as an early short-term victor in this disaster that is unfolding here in the United States, this political disaster and the divisions here. And prior to President Trump, there was no bipartisan difference in the United States on whether or not we should be supporting the Ukrainian government. Republicans and Democrats agreed, but now, of course, President Trump has come in with a very different message and a very negative one.
And finally, that brings me to President Trump. I gotta think if there wasn't a scintilla of chagrin or shame after the Mueller report came out, and obviously the election interference that he welcomed, and obviously everything that was found in that report, if the next day he then made the phone call and tried to do the very same thing, albeit with a different partner in Ukraine, if at the end of the day the Senate doesn't elect to convict him, I think the message he's going to walk away is, hey, I think I found a winning strategy. I'm going to do only more of this between now and November of 2020.
Well, it's certainly ironic, and it shows the hubris, I would say the arrogance of Donald Trump, that one day after Robert Mueller decided not to prosecute him for possible collusion with the Russians in 2016 or obstruction of justice, one day later, he then went to the Ukrainians and essentially, I think, abused presidential power. He asked a foreign government to interfere in the 2020 elections. That's why I think he should be impeached. I think he should be convicted in the Senate and removed from office. That's unlikely to happen. He'll be impeached, I think, and likely to be removed by the Republican-controlled Senate, and that just means that we, the people, on November 3rd, 2020, I hope will remove Donald Trump from office through the ballot box, through a free and fair election.
Ambassador Nickolas Burns, thank you so much for a few minutes. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
All right, so we go from the foreign policy side to, on the other side of the break, the legal side. In fact, we're going to bring in a former WATERGATE prosecutor. He'll give us his take if what we're looking at right now is even worse than what Nixon did, and where he sees this going. Is there a path here that there could be a conviction for the president? Stay with us.